Thank you for joining the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences. This evening, you've joined the Age of Consent panel discussion. So we'll be discussing consent, what it is, potentially what it isn't, and how it can both help and hinder sexual autonomy. Tonight is also the launch of the first episode of the Age of Consent podcast. And we'll be telling you a bit more about the podcast itself, how it came to be, and what the people who have participated in creating the podcast have learned while having these conversations to create it. Before we get started and before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. So firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Gabrielle Blackburn. I'm the co-founder of Narrative Matters and the co-creator of the Age of Consent podcast. I'll be your host tonight. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We've got a lot of people signed up tonight, so it'd be lovely to hear where you're listening in from, and also why you're interested in joining this conversation. Throughout the event, we'll be encouraging audience participation. So it is a panel discussion, but we'd really like to have your contributions throughout so we can know what questions you have, what thoughts and reflections you have on what's being discussed, and we can pick them up and address them as we go along. We think the conversation will definitely be richer for it. At this stage, I'd also like to mention that obviously we'll be discussing consent. So themes of rape, sexual violence, gender-based violence, sexual assault will be present throughout the discussion. So when you contribute, please bear that in mind. So be mindful of the fact that these are issues that affect a lot of people, and some of them might be present tonight. So please just be thoughtful and kind in your comments. Likewise, the comments you'll add to the chat tonight will be visible under the YouTube video once the event is finished. So also bear that in mind before sharing anything in the comment section. I also like to point out that the chat will be moderated tonight. So without further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speakers. First, we're joined by Dr. Laura Lammasniemi. Laura is a legal history researcher at Warwick University. She is a Leverhulme Fellow, and as part of her research project, she commissioned the Age of Consent podcast that we will be discussing here tonight. Laura, can you tell us a few words about yourself and your work?
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Gabrielle. So I am Laura Lammasniemi. I'm an assistant professor at Warwick Law School. I'm really excited about this event, and it's great that it's finally happening. So I'm currently working on a larger research project that is looking at the history of sexual consent in criminal courts. So in that project, what I'm really interested in is how did people think about, how did they speak about, and how did they understand sexual consent in 19th and in early 20th century. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laura. Next up, we have Dr. Tanya Serisier. Tanya is a criminologist and researcher at Birkbeck University, and she's also the author of Speaking Out, Feminism, Rape, and Narrative Politics. And Tanya is also an interviewee on the 5th and final episode of the Age of Consent podcast series. Tanya, could you also introduce yourself?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks so much for having me. As Gabrielle said, I work on basically feminist politics and how feminist and queer activism and scholarship has changed our kind of social and cultural norms around sex and sexuality. And I am a reader in criminology in the Birkbeck Law School. And so my book looks at the kind of 50 years history of survivors speaking out about sexual violence and the impacts that that's had. And I also do work on how the conversations that we have around consent, what we ask it to do, have changed over the past decades. And I focus a bit less on the law than Laura, but look also at the way that the law and kind of cultural norms and conversations intersect. And I'm very excited to be here tonight.
Thanks. We're really excited to have you too. Lastly, we have Amrita Ahluwalia McMidis. Amrita is the other co-founder of Narrative Matters and the other co-producer of the podcast. Amrita, could you introduce yourself and also tell us a bit more about the podcast itself?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. So my name is Amrita Ahluwalia. My name is Amrita Ahluwalia McMedis. I have been all my life. And in my day job, I am a social psychologist and I teach research methods. But with my other hat, I work with Gabrielle, and we co-founded Narrative Matters after we made our first podcast together, which was the Scottish Feminist Judgments podcast. And after that, we really wanted to do more. We wanted to make more podcasts because we really enjoy kind of communicating research. Particularly research that has kind of a feminist perspective or that tells stories of minority perspectives as well. So we were very excited when Laura got in touch with us to make The Age of Consent. And we're also very much looking forward to sharing it with you tonight as well.
Thanks, Amrita. And in the chat, I can see that Victoria has joined us from Ayrshire's rape crisis, which is exciting. So hi, Victoria. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will now be playing you a short clip of our podcast just to give you a bit of a sense of what it covers. And yeah, just to give you a bit of a preview of the content.
In your own words, how would you define consent?
I need some time to think about this. How would I define sex? I think I'm too ingrained in the legal definitions of today.
I mean, I don't think the definition that's there is terribly off the mark. So, I think it's just that, it's that sense of being empowered to control access to your body and to have that listened to and respected. And in that sense, as I say, I don't think the legislation's terribly off the mark as an ideal, but the difficulty is that freedom is a complicated concept, capacity is a complicated concept.
I would define it as the minimum. It's very depressing when people are kind of struggling to see was there or was there not consent. I think that's a sort of starting minimum. Good sexual behaviour ought to be well beyond that, and thinking about mutuality and enthusiasm as opposed to, am I going to get in trouble with the law about this?
What do we mean by sexual consent? It turns out that that's quite a difficult question. In this 5-part series, we will explore our ideas about consent, where they've come from and how we tend to use them, particularly in our laws, and how these ideas have evolved both legally and socially. My name is Amrita Ahluwalia McMedis, and this is The Age of Consent. This podcast is a series of conversations about how we discuss consent as a society, the evolution of our laws, how these laws are implemented, and how our notions of consent and sex might develop in the future. We'll start with a tale of scandal in Victorian London. It's a tale that shows how ideas and laws around consent, in one context at least, have been influenced and shaped, and how we can learn a lot from looking back at our social and legal past. This is the story of the maiden tribute of modern Babylon, a serial expose written by William Thomas Stead, published in the Pall Mall Gazette in July of 1885. It shocked middle-class Victorian readers, and not only did it cause a mass scandal, but it triggered an important change for consent in English law. William Stead is remembered today as a pioneer of investigative journalism. The maiden tribute was written to uncover child prostitution in Victorian London. It drew from an undercover mission to show how easy it was to procure an innocent young girl from the East End of London and make her disappear. Stead arranged to buy a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong. He paid her mother £5, or in the words of the advertising placards for the Pall Mall Gazette, £5 for a virgin warranted pure. Eliza and her mother both believed she was going into domestic service. Following this purchase, Eliza was drugged with chloroform and taken to a brothel where she was examined to verify her virginity. After this, Eliza was quickly transported to France and placed under the care of the Salvation Army, as arranged by Stead. After the publication of the maiden tribute, Stead, along with a number of others who had helped him, was arrested and tried for the abduction of Eliza. So why had he done it? Stead was a passionate social reformer, and the maiden tribute had been undoubtedly aimed at forcing through a change in legislation. Stead was crusading to raise the age of consent, which at the time was 13. In the preceding decade, there had been numerous failed attempts to raise it. But soon after the maiden tribute was published, the Criminal Law Amendment Bill of 1885 was passed. Section 5 of this bill raised the age of consent to 16 for sex outside marriage, and the maiden tribute was the catalyst that brought about this change.
So those were the first 4 minutes of our first episode, and we played it to you so that it kind of illustrates the different sides and the different aspects that we cover in the podcast. So history is a big part of the podcast. We use the maiden tribute throughout all the episodes to illustrate different points as we go along and explore different aspects of different social and legal aspects of consent. But those clips that you heard at the beginning, where our interviewees are attempting to define consent, is a response that we got to a question that we asked every interviewee, which is, in your own words, how would you define consent? And I'd be interested to hear from the audience at this stage, how would you answer that question? It's a tricky question to answer. So, if you're not 100% certain how to answer it, that's fine. Because one of the things that we look at in this podcast is, expert or not, it's a difficult question to answer. It can be very complicated. And the more we delve into the question, the more complex it got. So yeah, if you could try to answer this question in the chat, we'll pick them up later and try to discuss your answers in a bit. But I'm going to pass over to our panel now to reflect on, why do you think it is? Why is it such a difficult question to answer what consent is? Laura, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. And I should probably say that I have a really bad cold. It's my first cold in 2 years. So I'm very nasal, and I apologize in advance, and I might burst out coughing at any point. So apologies. It will probably happen. So yeah, I think as I'll reflect on this question a little bit from a historical perspective, because that's what I've been working on a lot in the last 2 years, really. And I would definitely recommend everyone to pop in their answers to the chat, because when Gabrielle and Amrita asked me this question on how would you define consent, it took me by an absolute surprise, and I couldn't answer it. And then I tried to answer it later, and I realized I still couldn't answer it. So it's been a long process of actually trying to think about, how do I answer this question? I can reflect on that as well a little bit later. But so from a historical perspective, I was thinking maybe I'll say a few words about what can we learn from a historical perspective when we think about why is it so difficult to define this, or how it's so difficult to answer this question. And I think the most important thing for me, what I have realized in the last few years, is that it has always been a very difficult concept. So we tend to think about sexual consent as something that is quite new, it's quite modern, but it's really not. So criminal law is a sphere that I work in, and for centuries, criminal law has really relied on this idea that rape is something that is done to a woman against their will or without their consent. But the law has also never really defined what consent is, not until 2003. So the definition of rape in criminal law is incredibly new in the grand scheme of things. So throughout the centuries and throughout history, when people have been looking at consent in a criminal context, they have always needed to bring their own definition of it. They have always needed to bring their own interpretation of it to these trials. So at every trial, you had this sort of new interpretation, a new idea what sexual consent was, because there was not that formal definition of what it is. And so in my current project, I've been looking at 19th century and 20th century, and I've been looking at a lot of victim and statements and depositions and the things, basically the statements that people have given to courts in those periods. And what is clear from the statements and things that I've been looking at is that actually people had very, very different ways of speaking about consent. They have very different ways of thinking about it. And what I found is that actually different actors in the same trial would often define it, they would often use the term consent in a very different sense. So in 19th century, even in 20th century, you would have judges, you would have medical experts, and all these sort of official men in the court who tended to often think about consent as something that was very physical. So for them, not consenting was a physical act. They needed to see resistance, they needed to see injuries, they needed to see torn clothing, so some sort of physical evidence. And it was clear that for them it was a very physical thing. But then actually on the same trial, you would have women who had been victims, and they would be describing their own experiences in a very, very different sense. And often for women who were giving testimony, their views was very different from those of judges. Like they would talk about their resistance and things that they knew court was expecting to hear. But women actually, even in 19th century, even in some earlier trials, you could see the women were talking about not wanting it. They feel like they submitted, they were confused, they didn't know what to do. And in few cases that I've seen, women would say things like, well, actually, yes, I said I would have sex with him, but he promised to pay me and then he didn't pay me. So therefore I didn't consent. And so in 19th century, the courts were completely unable to deal with this. But what is clear from these testimonies is that actually women had a much more, often quite a more nuanced and what we would consider maybe more modern way of speaking about consent than judges did. So I think sort of if you look back in history, I think one of the key things that come very clearly is that there was never that one single understanding of what consent was, but actually people spoke about it and reflected on it in very different terms 100 years ago as much as they do today.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, that historical perspective really shines a light on some of the ways in which we attempt to define consent now and sort of where the roots are. Tanya, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you see that reflected now in the narratives that we have around consent now and why it's difficult to define it.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I did think when I was preparing for this is that, this question is almost as complicated as the attempt to give a definition of consent itself, because there's so much that comes into it. And Laura's talked about the kind of legislative history. I think one thing that we need to think about is the difficulties or problems we have in our society in terms of talking about sex, about imparting learning, building capacity, knowledge around sex, communicating that, the way that's entailed in kind of structural dynamics between women and men, heteronormativity, because it makes sense that we would struggle with the concept of sexual consent when we're a society that actually struggles with, ideas of sexual pleasure as well. And that's something that I think feminism for the last 50 years has really tried to deal with in terms of rethinking sex and sexuality, has always had this kind of binary approach almost. And in the 1980s, they used to talk a lot about sex as a realm of pleasure and danger. And so the question was, how do you, for women especially, enhance and create the conditions for women to experience sexual pleasure while, reducing, preventing the danger and the harm that many women experience with sex. And I think one of the complexities we have with consent now is that, again, we've pulled it, into that binary. And I can see in the comments, a lot of people are talking about things like a precondition. We have this idea that it's a legal baseline, but then we also want it to be able to help us to do something around enhancing, expanding pleasure, building a sexual ethics. And so I think, there's a real question, and Joe Fischel, he's an academic from the US who writes a lot about consent, says basically, it's become difficult to talk about consent because we've tried to do too much with it. And I think, that's, in many ways a kind of supportable position. It works maybe quite well as a kind of baseline. Does it work for actually letting us think about the ways we want sex to be good, the ways we want to enact sexual ethics with each other? I think that's a much more controversial question. And when we want to go beyond, and that's what a lot of people are talking about, going beyond simply an absence of violence, do we need broader, kind of bigger conversations? And I think we do expect and want more from sex, in part because of kind of queer and feminist movements. But these movements have also made us think about the way that many of our models of sex are based on, a kind of very, what I would call heteronormative, but a very old-fashioned idea of, the man seeking sex, the woman saying yes or no, being a gatekeeper. That's kind of bound up in the concept in some ways, and is really problematic in terms of attempting to develop a mutuality. A lot of feminist work has looked at the way that women particularly, have a lot of societal pressures around needing to be sexually chaste and sexually available at the same time, needing to navigate that, thinking about sex within relationships as something that's sometimes owed to a partner. And I'm sorry, I've gone on for a long time because I think it is complex, but our interactions with each other are really complicated and structured by power. And at this point in history, we've made consent the central concept for trying to unravel that in relation to sex. And that's, I think, what makes it so difficult.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the points you've both touched on there are reflected already in the chat. Those tensions about what can we make consent do, and what consent just can't do, and how do we tie those two pieces together in order to reach some form of sexual ethics that actually works, as you say, Tanya, both to enable happy sex and to prevent the harms that can come from violence. I'm going to read some of the definitions in the chat in a second, but I thought I would ask Amrita also, through all the creation of the podcast and talking to all these different experts on consent, what do you take away in terms of why you think that some of our experts might have struggled to answer this question?
Yeah, so I think this question wasn't one that we were always planning to ask people, but it became, so I think with Laura, you may have been blindsided by it in some of the early interviews, but I think it became apparent that it was going to be a really interesting question, and I'm so glad that we did ask it, because it was clear that, and I think as Gabrielle said, so we were talking to people that look at consent all the time in their work, like yourself, Laura and Tanya, and it was clearer that the more you looked, the harder it got to kind of pin down. And I think as a person being asked to do this, to define consent in your own words, it's a question that carries quite a lot of weight, because obviously you're suddenly aware of the responsibility of answering it. And do you go for kind of what you think a legal definition should be? Do you go for what you think how it should work? Do you go for kind of what you think that relationships should be? So there's just so many kind of multiplicities in asking and answering this question that I think we tried to explore in the podcast. It was really interesting to hear all the different responses to this question, because it's not an easy thing to do. And yeah, that was one of the things that we found really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that tension of what definition are we trying to give? Are we giving the legal definition? Are we giving the social definition? Are we giving the definition that we hope to be implemented in the future? And you can see that tension. So, we've got some people answering, agreeing freely and by choice. And I think that's quite in line with British law. And then we have sort of some people saying it's a basic requirement before engaging in sexual activity, which again, I think does echo that kind of contractual nature that we have in law. And a few people just saying they've just been struggling to find a definition that they're happy with. Some people saying, I really want the definition to not revolve around the absence of sexual violence. And a lot of people saying something that both people agree to. It has to be something that both people agree to. And it can be withdrawn at any time. So suddenly the temporality of it is also present in the answer. It's not just necessarily before. Yeah, we've got consent can be withdrawn at any time. A lot of people saying it's complex and it has many layers. And it is a constant. And Monica at the end there says, what kind of concept is consent? It's a state of mind, is it a state of mind or an action? There's one comment in particular that I was wondering if you could, if you had any thoughts on. Rebecca says that she is looking at I think it was Rebecca. Somebody was looking at obstetrics violence. And saying that they look at consent through, thank you. Yeah, it is Rebecca, obstetric violence, but really interested in what I can learn about consent and harm in sexual consent. So we can see that the concept of consent applies not just in a sexual realm, but consent obviously expands further than that. I found that one interesting as well, just to show the different ways in which consent can be applied. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that comment, Laura?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it is super interesting, and I think even from a historical perspective, I think that has actually quite a long legacy of associating some forms of like medical examinations, and particularly in sort of in 19th century, which is the period that I mainly focus in. In that period, there's a lot of there's a lot of feminist campaigning and around issues of sexual consent. We heard early on about the maiden tribute, so people who were campaigning those issues around age of consent. They had early on campaigned very heavily on issues around regulation of venereal disease. So in that sort of late 19th century period, there was a lot of concern around venereal disease, and there was a few laws that sort of meant that women who were working as sex workers, they had to submit themselves to compulsory medical examinations if they were if the police suspected that they might be suffering from venereal disease for no obvious reason. So a lot of feminist campaigners then at the time, they were actually making that link. They were making that link around certain kind of gynecological procedures and medical examinations and rape. So that language actually has a really long history there. And there's a lot of so in that period, it's quite common to think about rape also not simply as a sort of a sexual act and sexual penetration, but also more broadly a violation of women in different kind of sphere, including the medical sphere. So there is some sort of there's quite a long route to that discussion, I would say.
Yeah, and Tanya, I remember you talking about the concept of consent moral magic.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I feel like that's
yeah, no, and that does come from the use of consent in law, particularly around things like medicine. And the idea is that in law, consent performs a moral magic where it takes an action that would be unacceptable, and through giving consent, it turns it into something that, you know, is acceptable, is even potentially positive. You know, and kind of a classic example is I went to the dentist today. As you know, dentistry is, you know, just sticking your hand in someone's mouth and pulling out a tooth is a bad thing to do. But if they give you informed consent around that, there's a moral magic that's performed, and it's no longer a bad thing to do. And, you know, so that's, and again, I think this comes back to then the tension of that model within sex and sexuality, because in an example like that, it's quite clear cut that someone is doing something to someone else. You know, there's an active party, there's a party that consents to the action and is relatively passive. You know, is that then translatable into a sexual context, and would we want it to be? Or does it end up reinforcing, you know, very kind of, as I said before, standard ideas about sex as something one person does to another, which I think is not most people's, you know, or many people's model of good sex. And so the question is, can it perform that same moral magic in the same way in the realm of sex? Or is it something, you know, do we need to think a little bit differently?
That kind of brings us nicely onto another question that I have for you all, which is one thing that kept coming back throughout all our interviews was the fact that while consent was better than any other concept that we'd had up until now, it's clear that, you know, there's still some sticking points with it, and it's not clear that it's necessarily the best thing that we could have, as you just said. And so I guess, how does thinking about consent help improve it? So like, why is it important to reflect on where these ideas come from, and why it's difficult to define it? Amrita, would you like to start on this one? Like, why do you think it's important to reflect on how we think about consent?
Yeah, so I think something particularly useful, I think, in our context for putting the podcast together was drawing from Laura's approach and also Tanya's, but in pulling in kind of the long form view of where consent has come from, how we've got to our current notions, what how it operates in law, how our understanding of it has developed over time. And I think that's something I particularly found useful in kind of putting the narrative of the podcast together. And we draw quite a lot from the Maiden Tribute. You'll heard a little bit of it in the clip. And I think that was incredibly useful because obviously it's just a kind of snapshot in time. It's a particular kind of event that resulted in a legal change in Victorian England. And it's easy to dismiss it as kind of this story about eccentric Victorians and their weird, warped views on sex. And of course, that was then reflected in laws and how kind of rape was legislated and understood and how victims were treated and so on. But it was very useful kind of using it to draw parallels and thinking about what our warped views of sex are now, how they kind of creep in to the way we approach these things, the way we legislate, what's changed, what stayed the same. And I thought that was a really useful and interesting way of going about looking at the question.
Yeah, almost like looking at, again, I'm going to hand that back over to you, Laura, because it's about looking at history to try and understand our current understanding, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think we did a lot of that in the podcast. And I think what I really liked about working with you and working on the podcast is that I could sort of talk about history to my heart's desire, which is what I like to do. But also then what I really liked that there was so many other perspectives there. So when you listen to the podcast series, there's people who are reflecting on this on all different perspectives. So people who are working with the issues of consent in their own frame. So there would be academics, but also like practitioners, people who work with survivors. And what I really liked about it is that actually suddenly listening to the podcast, you can hear how all of those people who spend all their time thinking about consent, they are having these conversations. And it was really interesting to see what came out of those conversations. And I think for me, sort of going back to original question, reflecting on how do we speak about consent, I actually realized how incredibly wedded I am to that kind of legal criminal sphere, and sort of hearing those other perspectives and hearing other people talk about their work was actually a fantastic thing to sort of made me realize my own sort of narratives and how wedded I am to criminal narratives, but also seeing how nicely those conversations came together and how many different perspectives we had on the issues that you brought about. And I think also, when we were working on this and sort of working particularly with Gabrielle and Amrita on this and sort of seeing how different their starting points or many of the questions and how differently they approach things, it sort of made me reflect quite a lot on that very process of defining consent and that very process of thinking about consent. And I think what I also realized why it's important to do it, because there is such a massive gap, like uncomfortable gap between those relatively narrowly defined, narrowly thought about legal processes, and then this vast reality of consent that actually exists in the real world. So the way that people speak about consent, the way people go through their lived experiences, the way that consent has really entered people's, obviously sexual relationships for sure, but also sort of broader relationships, the way people think about space, the way people think about things that they feel uncomfortable with. So there's like a whole world of consent, and there's a lot of work that consent is doing on people's daily lives. And then we have these narrow legal processes. And I think sort of working on the podcast and reflecting on that idea of defining it, thinking about consent, has made me realize that it's very hard, if not almost impossible, to bring the two into a conversation. And it is quite an uncomfortable thing, I think, to realize that actually the law is quite far apart from where that sort of real life discussion and experiences of consent is at the moment.
Yeah, I'd actually be really interested if you can pop in the chat, because that's something else that came up frequently in the podcast, is what is the role of law in regulating consent? What can it do? Should it teach? Should it regulate? Should it inform? What is the role of law in this conversation? And we have a variety of perspectives here in the room with us. You know, we've got rape crisis practitioners, we've got researchers in completely different fields as well. And here again, we have Rebecca, who's adding a comment, who's saying that this discussing this tension is helpful. She's working on vaginal exams and the harms that women experience during those unconsented exams and the structure and power that's involved in that. And you can really see that there's just so many things that come into play. And with the law, it's quite narrow. It has to be narrowly defined, and it's important for it to be narrowly defined. And so that creates a real tension. Tanya, I wonder if you could say anything about why do you think it is important to reflect on how we think about consent?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of go back to that previous comment and talking about the structural power context within which consent is sought, I mean, that is something that we get to think about when we do think more reflectively about consent as well, because definitely in the 1980s, there were a lot of feminist debates about whether consent would be adequate for legislating sexual violence, because, you know, people asked, you know, what are the contexts in which, if we're talking about heterosexuality particularly, it's meaningful for women to give or not give sexual consent? You know, at what point are, you know, social pressures, social forces, power imbalances so, you know, forceful that actually just saying someone consented becomes relatively meaningless? And, you know, they were really live debates. And I think that what we see then is a movement into law and a change in the way that both law and society begin to think about consent. So the very kind of famous slogans from the 1970s and 1980s, you know, no means no, they come into a lot of legal statutes in the 1980s through to the 1990s. Then what you have is a kind of social process of going through and saying, yeah, but if someone doesn't say no, what does that actually tell you? You know, and you get a lot of dissatisfaction socially and culturally, firstly with that model of consent, and then particularly over the past kind of 10 years, a bit more than that, legal statutes have begun to follow that too. So you see a move jurisdictionally away from a no means no model of consent and standard in the law to a yes means yes model of consent and standard in the law. And then, you know, what then follows from that is the questions that we're kind of talking about now, which come back to those questions about power and context. You know, under what conditions might people say yes, you know, without really wanting to? Can the law judge that? You know, is it an adequate space to do that? And I think that when we start to think about consent in that way, we look at the changes and we realize, you know, it's important to reflect on it. And this was actually my point. It's important to reflect on it because we construct the meaning of it. You know, we construct it socially, we construct it legally, and those definitions come back and forth. And they are reflexive because they do change over time. I mean, this is one of the areas of the criminal law, sexual violence, that's most regularly reformed over the last 50 years. You know, that there's been the kind of most legislative change, and that's because of those kinds of reflections. And I think, talking specifically about my work, one of the things that I research, as I mentioned before, is the kind of cultural, political impacts that survivor testimonies, survivor stories have had on our understandings of sex, sexuality, and sexual violence. And it's really difficult to overstate the ways in which, you know, the experiences of mainly women, but not only, who've experienced sexual violence, as they gradually claim space in the public realm, really change the way that it's acceptable, it's appropriate, it's understood to talk about sexual violence. And that feeds into the definition of consent as well. So that would be that would be my summary. I think we need to reflect on how we think about consent, because we are in an ongoing social process that's been going for kind of half a century now of changing, modifying, attempting to adapt that. And kind of sitting over that is the conversation that has been going alongside that for the whole time as well. Is this an adequate tool? In what areas will it work? In what areas will it not? And that's also something that we are actually working through legislatively and socially all the time.
Yeah, and there's that, again, that tension, because it's so difficult to define, and you do need a very clear definition in law. While we're changing our definition, then it's even difficult just to provide a layperson's definition. How does that engage with our legal structures? And what you were saying at the beginning, Laura, when we didn't have a definition, at each trial, the definition was just different depending on who was judging it. So I've got another tricky question for all of you then, because if if the current definition or the current concept of consent isn't exactly what we would like it to be, or we're not entirely sure that it can actually enable ethical sex, how can we improve on it? How can we make it better? And I'll open the floor to whoever wants to go first.
I can go. I can go first because I think it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. I think my views on this has drastically changed since I started my current project, and I think I've become. I sort of had this conversation with Gabrielle and Amrita before, but I think I've become increasingly wary of the concept as a whole. There's been a lot of feminist critique of concepts over the decades. Is nothing new, but I think personally I've become increasingly wary of the term of consent and what it can actually do and what it can actually achieve. And it is a malleable term. It's a term that can be quite easily manipulated. It's not very easy to translate into legal processes, and I think there is that kind of underlying thing of maybe actually it's masking some harm and sort of concerns underneath. So when that moral magic happens that Tanya was talking about, I think consent can have that sort of silencing effect where we say, oh, consent is here, and then we're happy, we can relax, we don't need to talk about it anymore, we can just move on. So I think there is that kind of concern that consent can be actually really silencing or causing that moral magic, when it means that we are moving away from what is actually quite potentially harmful and serious things. All of this week and all of this year, I've been sitting on in the National Archives, kind of going through these depositions and victim testimonies and statements that people have been giving to courts. And actually, just yesterday, I came across this this case where it's quite a brutal case of 1940s. Of it's a teenage girl was raped by 7 men in her community. So they were all living in the same community in the same streets. 7 young men brutally attacked this girl for a long period of time. And normally when I've been reading these victims' testimonies, people speak to the court in quite a similar manner. Like victims want to emphasize how they didn't consent, and often defendants want to emphasize how the victim did consent. And this case was very different, and I was really struck by this case for a number of reasons. But for one is that the defendants in this case, they sort of kept talking about in an incredibly graphic detail of what they did. They were talking about it in a factual way. There was no sense of remorse, or there was no way of playing to the courts of the things that people normally want to play to the courts. So they were incredibly graphic. They were incredibly detailed, explaining exactly what they did, exactly what the other men did. And then on the other hand, we had this girl's testimony. So a young teenage girl who was clearly just sort of trying to work through what had actually happened. So in her testimony, she had 1 line, maybe 2 lines of explaining what happened. And in the testimony, she just sort of kept going on about how she's a fun-loving girl. She likes boys, she's fond of boys. She has kissed a boy before. So there was clearly this girl who was having had an incredibly traumatic experience, but then was trying to diminish how traumatic that experience was. I was trying to diminish how severe and how serious the situation was. So it's clear that in this testimony, the court, this girl is working through what would have been an incredibly traumatic experience, and then to try to diminish the harm, because probably in a way that made sense to her and made her feel better about what had actually occurred. And this case, I think, is very important. It's an important case in many ways, but I think that point of someone trying to make sense of what happened to them, I think that is really important. And I think when we are thinking about the way that people discuss things when it comes to courts, people want to make stories in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that makes them feel safe, in a way that makes them feel comfortable about who they are, the kind of things that they would do to other people, but also in the kind of things that they would feel like they would have accepted. And I think that's where consent is always going to be a tricky concept, because the way the stories that people tell themselves and the stories that people tell to the court and to other people are always going to be clouded by the visions that people have of what kind of people we are and what kind of things we are comfortable with. So I think when we take such a kind of difficult things and we try to translate them into court language, a lot of things get lost. And then there is that danger of when we rely on concept of consent so much, a lot of things get lost behind, and a lot of things get lost. And I think for me, the question isn't really on how do we improve consent, but it's much more how do we move beyond that. Like we played that clip in the beginning where Gwen was talking about, well, it's the minimum threshold. The very least you can do is to make sure your sexual partner is consenting. And I think that is really the baseline. Consent should be the baseline. It's not the ending point. It's something where you then start to think about more complex things around harm and good sexual behavior and such things. So I think that needs to be the conversation we're heading towards, is that what comes after we hit this very low bar.
Beyond consent. That's pretty much all of episode 5, if you're looking forward to having a longer conversation about that. But Tanya, your book is a lot about those themes. Do you want to go next?
Yeah. And I will just follow on from that. I think I completely agree with Laura. And one of the things that I look at is narrative. So I work mainly with stories and how we tell stories about sex and sexuality, how they come into the legal sphere, but also the social sphere. And one of the things that you see that happens again and again, regardless of the kind of shifts in legal definition of consent, the move from no means no to yes means yes, is that both sides in a case, a criminal case, because you do just have two sides, are telling a different story. And as Laura said, the kind of classic story is the defendant will be saying this was consensual sex. The complainant will be saying, this was non-consensual sex. And the court then has to make sense of that story. And unfortunately, what courts tend to do is rely on the kind of most easily available and most powerful cultural narratives, the cliches, stereotypes. We often talk about them as rape myths, and look to things like, increasingly in the last few years, look to things like text messages, Facebook interactions and things to actually try and read consent in. And this came back, someone said, is consent a state of mind or is it an action? And I think it's, as the way the law interprets it now, it's kind of somewhere in between. And the law goes looking retrospectively for what it imagines the state of mind to be. And so changing the definition of consent doesn't stop the law looking to rape myths, looking to cliches, looking to kind of sexist stereotypes for solutions. And it also doesn't necessarily speak to the way in which we experience infringements on our autonomy. And I think actually autonomy can be a useful way of thinking socially a little bit differently to consent, because consent does imply a binary, it's present or it's not. Whereas concepts like autonomy speak a bit more to people's sense that, we have agency, but in many situations it's constrained as well. You have degrees of autonomy. You're making decisions yourself under various restrictions, and you have freer and less free kind of context in which you do that. And I think what we need to think about as a society is how we enhance sexual autonomy and enhance the space people have to make, to make these free choices like people were talking about. And consent, doesn't quite get us there. And I think, is it useful and adequate as a kind of legal baseline? There's different views on that, I think, possibly. Although one of the things that people who argue against that say is, that the problem with consent in the courtroom is it does mean that you're always looking to the complainant's state of mind. And so it brings a kind of focus on the complainant. Is she lying? What was she thinking? What was she doing? And if we actually thought about, autonomy and capacity, we would shift the focus away from that and away from the court's tendency to victim blame. But I think socially, what's been interesting to me in the last few years is there's a lot of discussions about the gray area of consent. And often you'll see, particularly in magazines like Cosmo and things, this kind of, it's seen as this big mystery and something that you can't interact with. And that's in part, I think, a function of this binary of consent. Whereas if we thought about something like degrees of autonomy, degrees of capacity, about the things that enhance or constrain that, then you kind of don't need to think in terms of this difficult gray area as something separate from the norm, but you can actually think about the ways our sexual interactions, all exist, sometimes, along a kind of continuum. And there are examples at one end where consent is denied, there are the very positive examples at the other end, but many people's sexual experiences, don't fit at either end of the spectrum and occupy an area in which, there are degrees of autonomy, there are degrees of pleasure, there are degrees of control that they feel that they exercise over the situation. And that can be the same for both people as well, that it's not always just that there's one person exerting unmitigated control and another person not. I mean, this is something that a lot of queer theorists and people who work with the LGBTQ community have talked about as well, is that when you move outside of the framework of heterosexuality, you do often find and within a lot of heterosexual relations too, but you do often find very complex narratives around sex and how people felt at different points in their interaction, who they felt had control, who didn't, that can shift as well. So I think, and as you said, I'm on episode 5 because I'm a bit of a skeptic about consent. But I'm also a skeptic about, in a sense, taking social cues from the law. I think that the law is not the place for us to be determining how we do sex better. I mean, I think it can point to, condemnation of sex when it's wrong, but we need to think beyond the law and legal concepts to make sex better. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and the academic You Share Your episode with Chloe Kennedy kind of ties those two themes together. Laura, you were kind of touching on almost identity and sex and how those interact, and Tanya, and talking about those gray areas and the spectrum of autonomy and where those boundaries lie. Chloe's doing research about trying to find those boundaries and trying to make some of those boundaries more explicit so we can actually know when we are legally responsible and when we are not, kind of that gray area being better defined, because currently there are things that we culturally might see as problematic in terms of whether or not consent was available. Well, it was there. Culturally might say it wasn't, but legally it's unclear where we stand exactly. And we're kind of back where we were, Laura, at the time where we were redefining consent at every trial because of that shifting in those boundaries. Amrita, I wonder, reflecting back on speaking to 13 experts on consent and listening to them and trying to make sense of it all, what do you think we could do to improve on our current concept of consent?
So I think it's a very tricky question, and I, as a layperson on consent at least, probably don't have the answer. But I think it was very interesting, obviously, having all of these conversations, and you touched on this already a little bit, but we had lots of different kind of responses to this question. So the kind of is consent good enough question. It's clear that there are obviously lots of deep problems with it, particularly for some of the reasons that kind of Laura and Tanya have mentioned, that it's this kind of false pressure point in a sexual interaction where you've got, the moral magic and everything needs to turn on it. And obviously in law, that creates a problem where the onus is entirely on proving that consent wasn't there. And that's, I think, not where we want the pressure to be. But also, I think, and I think this is something that Tanya says in episode 5, thinking about what the goal should be with this. So is the goal to kind of legislate rape and make sure that rape is tried successfully and effectively, or is it to kind of create a context where we don't have rape anymore? And I think that's a really powerful kind of question. And I don't think, from having these conversations with people, that perhaps consent is able to do that, and we need to do something beyond it. So yeah, hopefully it's something that we try to explore quite a lot in the podcast, is whether consent is fit for purpose or whether there's something else that we need to do.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left, so I thought I would give you all a chance to give some closing remarks, or if anybody has any burning questions for any of our panelists, please put them down in the comment section. But yeah, Laura, do you have anything that you'd like to add before we part?
No, I don't think I have anything. I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated, and Gabrielle for sharing this. And yes, everyone, please look out to our podcast series. There's a lot more of this, over 5 episodes.
Thanks. Amrita, anything you want to add before we leave?
No. Thanks everyone for being here, and I look forward to lots of people listening to The Age of Consent.
Thanks, and Tanya?
Yes, to say that it is a fantastic podcast. So everyone should listen to it. I found it extremely enjoyable. So yes, thank you.
Thank you. And I see a comment in the chat saying, is the podcast available? So that's my cue to promo the podcast. So the podcast, the first episode of the Age of Consent podcast is now available on Spotify and will be available on most streaming platforms very soon. So just keep an eye out on that. And you can follow us on all the social media platforms when you would like to hear more about when the next episodes will come out. That will be early December. So episode 1 is out today, and you can go listen to it as soon as you close this window. And all the other episodes will be available early December, and we'll be shouting out about it on social media. You can also sign up to our mailing list on our website, which is on the next slide, please. If you sign up to that, you'll get any information about our next productions. I also wanted to say a few words about Narrative Matters. As Amrita said, we started Narrative Matters after our first project, which was the Scottish Feminist Judgments podcast, which you can also find on our website. And our main focus is on taking academic work and translating it into something that lay people can engage with and listen to, and essentially translating lots of fascinating research into usually podcasts, but we're also open to other forms of creations. So if you are interested in running a project by us, please get in touch. All the information is on our website. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much for the interesting thoughts and comments in the chat. It was brilliant to hear from all of you. And I hope you enjoy the podcast as much as we enjoyed making it.